Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, written and directed by James Gunn. It is, arguably, in my opinion, probably the last solid Marvel movie we'll be getting. I don't know, was it just me, or the way this closed off, it felt like a goodbye to that era of Marvel that most of us grew attached to. I know Endgame ultimately served that purpose, but maybe it was just my gut telling me, hey, this is probably it, guys. But it's alright, they've had a good run. I know I don't really talk about superhero movies much, I've been burnt out of them for a while now, honestly even before Infinity War. But I've mostly had a fun time when it comes to the Marvel movies. Lots of great theater experiences starting with the very first Avengers movie back in 2012. I've always appreciated most of the character setup all the way until Phase 3. Everything after that has been slim pickings. No Way Home was fun, WandaVision was interesting, and Guardians 3 I think is my favorite movie out of everything that's been released after Endgame. This is a spoiler review, but I'd imagine most of you have seen it by now. It just came out on Disney Plus not long ago too. Rewatching this for the review, I still felt this held up. I mostly love everything about this, especially the mixtape soundtrack. There have been so many failed attempts to replicate that in other superhero films, but the Guardians movies have always consistently managed to weave songs that actually fit the theme and tone of the scenes rather than be in there for the sake of popularity or fan service. The intro to Guardians 3 is one of the best examples of that, next to the signature theme of Blue Suede's Hooked on a Feeling. Radiohead's Creep was a perfect segue for the crew following the events of Infinity War and Endgame. That's something that I want to take note of. None of these movies have tried shoehorning in current time pop songs or really songs that most people today would know. A lot of the songs in this trilogy are pretty obscure for the younger audience members, and I love that. Hooked on a Feeling came out in 1974, but it really blew up in popularity when the first Guardians came out. So the story here is mostly focused on trying to save Rocket. They need to bypass this security implant on his heart in order to treat him after getting shot. Even while Rocket is passed out for the majority of this movie, this is still very much his story. I've heard some complaints that given that this is the last Guardians movie, that this didn't really feel too much like an ensemble of the crew, since it focuses on Rocket's backstory a lot. And I can understand that, but remember, we had two other movies along with Infinity War and Endgame which already fleshed out most of the other members of the crew. We never got a really good look and understanding of Rocket until this movie, so I personally was okay with this approach. There's a lot of flashback scenes to Rocket's past. In general, I've always leaned more with the feeling that flashback sequences kind of kill the pacing of movies, but I think it was used well and made a lot of sense here. Rocket is essentially dying, so the backstory stuff serves as his life flashing before his eyes moment until the very end. I think that was a clever way to establish both Rocket's past and setting up the villain of this movie, the High Evolutionary. Let's talk about that antagonist here. Overall, despite 31 movies before, it's ironic that there's so few villains that we can look back to and really remember leaving much of an impression, let alone their names. I know Kang is supposed to be this generation's new big baddie on par with Thanos, but honestly, I really enjoyed the High Evolutionary a lot in this movie. To me, Thanos still stands to be the best villain of the Marvel movies, and Loki just beneath that. The actor's name looks impossible to pronounce, but it's actually not that bad, I don't think. Jakudi Iwuji. There, see, I think that's it. That's not so bad. He was awesome, totally hamming up his role. He's kind of overdramatic and yells a lot, but between those moments, I found him to be a really satisfying villain for the Guardians' last conflict, and I love him because I actually found myself hating him, which is more than I can say for most of Marvel's other villains. Loki was fun, and Thanos and Wanda are compelling, but the High Evolutionary is just so cruel and detached from any empathy. Those flashback scenes really help to highlight just how mean he really is. I don't think it would have been as effective if we hadn't seen that build-up. Take all those flashbacks out, and I think he would have been just as forgettable as Ronan from the first Guardians movie. For the rest of the crew, I'd say that they had their stories tied off satisfyingly enough. I do think Quill going back to Earth made sense, although it did feel a little out of left field, especially considering he'd made mention before about how Earth never felt like his home anyways. Him coming to terms with letting go of the Gamora that he knew to never return, I think, was resolved well enough. It's a lot better than the post-breakup recovery of Doctor Strange's story in Multiverse of Madness, and Drax being able to be a dad again was super wholesome. I think that's my favorite ending for his character out of everyone else here, and props to Mantis for finally taking the step to be fully independent from anyone, because she was right, she had just kind of been meandering from one group to another. Nebula had such a crazy arc ever since her first introduction. It's amazing to see how far she's come, and ending where she's leading the city in nowhere, I don't think anybody could have predicted she'd go so far from where she started. Character arcs, people, I fucking love them. And Groot is Groot. He finally spoke English. I'm proud of you, dude. Adam Warlock has overall seemed to have been the one too many cook inclusion to this movie I've seen people critique, which is understandable, but personally, I love this childlike naivety to this character. He kind of reminded me of Shazam. He's this kid trapped in this super powerful Superman-like body. He doesn't really understand the measure of his own strength, and I love the little moments like where he killed this grunt accidentally and felt pretty guilty afterwards. Him realizing what he likes and what makes him feel bad from his actions and eventually finding his own family was a nice journey for his character. character. But I do agree that his arc is much less developed compared to everyone else. I don't know if including a brand new character to the end of a trilogy was a good move. Honestly, I wouldn't have minded if he had his own movie before this. That would have maybe set him up a little better if they just had to include him in this movie. I don't think he brings the movie down. I still found him very entertaining, and I hope we get to see more of him in the future. At least if I'm still watching these movies by then. Contrasting this to Quantumania, the camera work in here was so much more distinct, which is honestly kind of an oddity. Alright, so the director of photography in this was Henry Brom. Great work. I love the motion of the shots, especially during the action scenes. The first fight between Adam Warlock and the Guardians was great. The camera tracks the motion of the actor's punches and movements really well without it becoming too disorienting in my opinion. Any scene where Warlock is flying, there's this really great motion blur effect that I think really helps translate his speed. Ironic considering Brom was also in charge of the Flash movie, and that looked awful. In my opinion. I don't get it. But contrast this to Quantumania, where the guy in charge of cinematography was Bill Pope. Believe it or not, you've seen his work before. He was responsible for the look of The Matrix, Spider-Man 2, Shang-Chi, and Baby Driver, to name a few. All really great looking movies. I just kind of found that ironic. Nonetheless, Henry Brom did a really great job in Guardians 3. There's so few Marvel movies that I can think of off the top of my head where I really took notice and appreciated the camera work as I do with this. Okay, so now I'm going to discuss my two major negatives of this movie, maybe three. And these stuck out to me a lot more during my second rewatch, which brought down the score to this just a little bit. First of all, the comedy. It's not the length of the jokes or the actual jokes themselves for the most part, but it's the timing. I know this sounds like a tired old complaint with Marvel movies, where the timing of the jokes can hinder really emotional scenes. This isn't as egregious as Thor: Love and Thunder, but I think the way that I can describe it best is how it amps up more as the movie went along. It serves best during the first and second act, but in the third, where most of the focus is on the drama, the quips I think kind of take away from that. The scene where Mantis, Drax, and Nebula finally get inside the high evolutionary ship, to me, is a good example of that, but reverse that for a second, because the F-bombs in this movie to me were hilarious, and the running gag of everyone dogpiling being super mean to Mantis was perfect, especially Drax. Like, Mantis is the sweetest member of this crew, and Nebula and Drax just constantly dig on her, and it's horrible, but it made me laugh every time. Mantis, you asshole. Alright, but the second thing is, this is kind of in the same vein as the first, but as much as I love the music here, the inclusion of the songs in certain scenes, I did think clashed tonally with the setup. Example being during the second to last flashback where Rocket learns that he and his friends are going to be incinerated, it switches back to the Guardians and then We Care a Lot by Faith No More starts to play. To me, that really killed the mood and the emotion of the scene beforehand. It didn't have that time to breathe and really sink in. Thankfully, this doesn't happen throughout the whole movie. That was just a particular case where it felt really jarring, and I wanted to make note of that. I'm not blaming the song itself. The lyrics are relevant, but having a harder rock song after this emotional scene, I felt clashed tonally with that revelation. The last complaint I have is the rewatchability in terms of length. First time I saw it, it flew right by, and I didn't even feel the runtime. I didn't have that issue the second time until around after Star-Lord and Groot escape from the high evolutionary ship. The third act is exciting, for sure. I'm glad this did not delve into another big CG army battle scene like in Quantumania. I'm so sick of those, it makes me want to barf. They could have very well done that here too. Instead of the Nowhere ship coming to the rescue, we could have had all the other civilizations that the evolutionary created come and help take down their oppressor, but luckily they didn't, and the long one-shot in the hallway scene where the Guardians are taking down those henchmen was a very slick and visually impressive scene. Again, high praise to Brom for the camera work on that, but I just felt that the movie could have been resolved on Counter-Earth instead. I don't know if the genocide scene was entirely necessary. I'm not complaining about that really. It's like, I get why it's there, but to me, less would have been more effective, because we didn't need him to destroy the planet to make us fear or hate the villain even more. We already had that set up. He scarred Rocket emotionally and killed all his friends. I think that alone sufficed. We have that emotional connection to Rocket built up after everything he'd been through. I don't know, to me, using Counter-Earth as just another set piece, I think, was unnecessary. Oh, and speaking of that, the brutality of this movie, man. Between the animal testing, Rocket's friends, the destruction of Counter-Earth, and just the overall violence included in this movie was really shocking. I mean, for a Marvel movie, that is. I've seen so much worse, but for a PG-13 Disney family movie, it was impressive what they were able to get away with. Gamora shooting that administrator during the heist to retrieve Rocket's file, like, for a gag, was really funny. I don't know if it was meant to be, but just the way it's filmed and how sudden it was, I found it to be pretty comedic. Maybe I'm just a horrible person, I don't know. Fun fact, that lady is actually James Gunn's wife, the more you know. But yeah, I'm very happy with the risks it took in that field. Multiverse of Madness was also surprisingly graphic, but For a Guardians movie, I was glad they decided to implement that into the action, as well as the overall darker tone for this movie. Personally, this is my favorite of the 3 Guardians of the Galaxy movies. I know 2 is kind of the black sheep of the 3 from what I've heard, but I kind of have a soft spot for it. None of these movies I find severely lacking in anything technical or story-wise. It's a fun ride. The Guardians were such a surprising crew to be added to the MCU. These movies really helped put them on the map in popularity, and I'm happy about that. Kinda wish the same treatment and care was put into the Eternals, but no sense crying about spilled milk at this point. But yeah, this is definitely up there on the top of my list for favorite MCU movies, and on my Letterboxd, this gets a 3.5 stars out of 5 for me. Socials below, thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. And here's a hot take, I actually enjoy these better than the Tom Holland Spider-Man trilogy. They're not bad, I just like the dynamic of this crew and the overall writing for these characters than I do for those films. As much as I have superhero fatigue, it's not because of the Marvel movies themselves. I'm more burnt out from the lack of compelling or any interesting material. I just wish it could lead somewhere again. I would be on board and excited for Avengers Kang Dynasty, but so far there's nothing that's really hyped me up for that except for the Loki show. Super excited for season 2 of that, by the way. Alright, so one very last thing. This is dumb. And not a critique. So in the movie during Rocket's afterlife experience where he sees his buddies again, why is it in their heaven or whatever that there's still cages? Like, is Rocket's perfect afterlife just playing tag back in the brig like when he was a pup? That's horrible. Also, it's just unrealistic. Everybody knows animals don't go to heaven. Come on. They don't have souls. They're just dumb, stupid creatures without... Alright, I'm joking, obviously. Chill. Because we all know there's no heaven. Okay, alright, I'll stop. Alright, good. Thank you guys. Bye.